Before we dive into today's journey, have you ever experienced something strange while out camping? Share your story in the comments below, and let's build this haven of eerie campfire tales together. My name's Paul Miller, and this all went down back in 2012 around March in the remote forest near Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. I was on a solo RV camping trip, something I'd been doing since I was a kid. These trips are my thing. There's nothing like it. Just you, your thoughts, and a beautiful, brutal stretch of nature. I'd driven my old 2004 Winnebago through the small Alaskan towns until they trickled down to dirt roads, and soon enough, it was only me and the vast, snowy emptiness. People in the last town I stopped by gave me all kinds of odd looks when I told them where I was heading. The forest was dense, lonely, a whole different beast from any place I had camped before. But hey, I was ready for it, or so I thought. The air was crisp, and a heavy silence blanketed the area as I parked near a frozen stream. I could hear the occasional crackle of ice shifting in the distance. I set up camp, cracked open a beer, and sat by the small fire I'd managed to get going, listening to the eerie quiet that settles in the woods at night. Sometime around midnight, I was starting to doze off by the fire when I heard footsteps in the snow, way too close for comfort. I sat up fast, scanning the trees. Figured it was maybe an animal, a moose or bear, but nothing showed. Just the occasional crunch of snow somewhere out there. "Who's there?" I called out, knowing it was pointless. I laughed to myself, shrugged it off, and eventually crawled back into the RV, locking the door more out of habit than fear. The quiet returned, but sleep wouldn't come easy after that. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a loud banging on the RV door, something aggressive and desperate. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight. I called out, "Who's there?" again, but whoever it was just kept banging. I stayed silent, waiting. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by the faint crunching of footsteps circling the RV. Then, in the dead of night, I heard a low voice right outside my window, like someone muttering to themselves, but too faint to make out the words. I froze. Whoever was out there was right up against the RV. I stayed perfectly still, listening to the muttering, realizing it wasn't just rambling. It sounded like they were counting slowly, as if keeping track of time. Each number spaced out, the voice steady. When the muttering finally stopped, I waited, hoping it was over. Then I heard what I can only describe as a chuckle, like they'd thought of some kind of joke just for themselves. Something felt off, wrong on a level I'd never felt before. I waited until dawn to step out, gripping a fire poker I'd brought for roasting marshmallows, the closest thing I had to a weapon. There were tracks in the snow around the RV, deep, erratic paths that looped around multiple times. Whoever had been out there was barefoot, which sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. I scanned the area, finding nothing but more footprints that faded into the trees. Shaken, I got back in the RV and decided I'd drive to the closest ranger station, a good 30 miles out. But the minute I tried to turn the ignition, I knew something was wrong. The RV wouldn't start, not even a click. I popped the hood, and what I found made my stomach drop. The wires had been cut, clean, neat, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing had been at work. I backed away, scanning the trees, wondering if they were still out there, hiding, waiting. I almost laughed at myself for even thinking it, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I packed up what I could fit in my backpack and started walking, hoping to reach the ranger station by noon. 30 miles was no joke, but I was more afraid of staying put than of the hike ahead. I'd been walking for about an hour when I started hearing that counting again, somewhere behind me. My mind raced. I forced myself not to turn around, kept my pace steady, hoping it was just my imagination. But it got louder, closer. It was him, the same low, steady voice, counting. This time I could hear his footsteps too. Crunch, 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 keeping time with the numbers. I finally turned, expecting to see some wild-eyed man charging after me, but there was no one there, just endless trees. The path behind me, quiet again. I kept moving, faster this time, scanning the forest every few steps, straining to hear if he'd followed me. But there was nothing, just the occasional snap of a branch, which could have been anything. The strangest part? As I kept moving, I started finding things in my path. Little objects in the snow that hadn't been there before. A single glove, a rusted hunting knife, a small plastic bag with something in it, like a clump of dark hair or animal fur. It felt like someone was leaving a trail, leading me somewhere. I ignored it, refused to touch anything. But the feeling that I was being played with gnawed at me. Another hour passed. I didn't hear the counting again, but the paranoia was eating at me. Every shadow seemed like him, every sound an echo of his footsteps. I kept a grip on that fire poker, feeling ridiculous, but too scared to let go. The path started to slope uphill, and I figured I was getting closer to the ranger station. Then I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A makeshift campsite just off the trail. An old ratty tent pitched in a clearing. My skin crawled at the sight of it. There were empty cans, scraps of food, and scattered belongings. It looked like someone had been living out there a while, hidden in the trees. But the worst part was what was hanging from the branches around the campsite. Bones, strung up with bits of cloth, dangling like some kind of twisted wind chime. I stepped back, stomach churning. Some of the bones looked human, small, like they could have been from a child. I heard a twig snap behind me and whipped around, poker raised, ready to swing. There he was, a lanky man with tangled hair and a wild look. His clothes, nothing more than rags. He grinned at me, showing teeth that looked like they hadn't seen a toothbrush in years. "Well, look who wandered into my neck of the woods," he drawled, his voice like gravel. I took a step back, keeping the poker between us. "Did you mess with my RV?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He laughed, a low, mean sound. Maybe I did. You sure got a pretty setup there. Looked too easy not to mess with." "Why?" I asked, my heart hammering. He cocked his head as if the question surprised him. "Why not? It's lonely out here, friend. Gotta make my own fun." Then he lunged. It was fast, faster than I'd expected. I swung the poker, connecting with his shoulder, but he barely flinched. He shoved me hard, and I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the ice. He was on me in a second, hands reaching for my throat. I kicked out, catching him in the knee, and he let out a grunt, just enough for me to scramble to my feet, ducking between trees, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches snagging my clothes, slowing me down. I could hear him crashing through the snow, laughing like he was having the time of his life. I forced myself to keep moving, praying I'd lose him in the trees. At some point, I tripped and fell hard, the wind knocked out of me. I lay there, gasping, and for a moment everything was silent. Then I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I pushed myself up, ready to run again, but he was right there, grinning down at me. "Game's over," he said, raising something shiny, a hunting knife covered in rust. But then, just as he moved in, a loud shout echoed through the forest. He froze, eyes wide, and stumbled back, clutching his arm, which was now bleeding. A ranger stepped out from the trees, rifle raised, eyes cold. "You all right?" he asked, barely glancing at me. His focus was on the man, who was now cursing under his breath, cradling his wounded arm. The ranger didn't wait for an answer. He stepped forward, gun steady, and the man backed away, that wild grin finally fading. He turned and disappeared into the trees, running as fast as he could. The ranger lowered his rifle and nodded at me. "Come on, let's get you out of here." I didn't say a word, just followed him, stumbling over the snow. I looked back once, but the man was gone. Just the tracks left in the snow and the hanging bones swaying in the cold morning air. The ranger drove me back to town, where I gave a statement to the local police. Turns out they'd been tracking that man for years. He was an old prospector, they said, gone rogue after his family died. Some folks claimed he'd gone mad from the isolation, living out there and luring in unsuspecting campers for fun. The police found the campsite, the bones, everything. Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. My name's Brian Gibson. Back in 2012, I was working for the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, dealing with one of the oddest cases that had ever crossed my desk, and I'd been at this for almost a decade by then. I thought I'd seen it all until I landed in a remote corner of the Catskill Mountains to look into a case that just kept getting stranger the deeper I went. The details came in rough. Somewhere outside the nearest town of Rosendale, there were reports of 2 campers gone missing. Friends, no family connection. Both locals from downstate who had decided to do a weekend trip out of the city. Typical enough, really, until you hit the next part. According to the county sheriff's report, another camper, a guy named Joey Kessler, found their campsite abandoned. Sleeping bags, supplies, tents, still up. He claimed he'd heard something wrong out there, but nothing clear enough to explain what happened to those 2. The way he described it to the deputies sounded like your basic, they just took off situation, so they didn't dig too deep until he finally got pushy enough. Now, normally I'd handle cases like these from a distance. Paperwork, missing persons reports, coordinates for search teams. But something in the initial report bothered me. Joey had been pretty insistent that there was something wrong out there, something he couldn't quite explain. It was vague enough that I chalked it up to his imagination until he described the last thing he'd seen. Footprints. Deep, like someone had just stomped all over the campsite. And then he added, they weren't exactly human either. Curiosity got the better of me. A drive out there, 2 hours from the closest hotel, wasn't too much to ask for a first-hand look. Besides, after staring at paperwork for so long, you start to wonder if you've lost your edge. The sheriff, Grant Winslow, picked me up from the edge of town. He was as haggard and resigned as you'd expect out here. One of those old-timers who didn't see much difference between city folk and the critters running around his forests. He was smoking on the ride, clearly irritated to have another federal type poking around in his woods. "Brian, right?" he asked, glancing over with a kind of squint. "Don't see why they sent you all the way out here. Boys go missing all the time around these parts." "Maybe," I said, but Joey Kessler seemed pretty shaken up, don't you think? "Joey's always shaken up over something," Grant grunted, tossing his cigarette butt out the window. "But yeah, his story this time is a bit odd. So you do what you gotta do. But I tell you, once you set foot in that spot, you'll see there's nothing out of the ordinary. It's a forest. Forests are strange. People just don't belong here." I let the silence settle as we drove the next 30 minutes up into the hills, all the way to the start of a rough trail that would lead us to the campsite. Grant parked the truck and gestured toward the trail. "All right. This way, unless you've got your own map," he said, already heading up. "I'll take the lead," I replied, trying not to let him see that I was itching to get a better look at whatever had spooked Joey. I wasn't a fan of unexplainable things, but I'd come across enough bizarre scenes in my work to know when to trust my gut. And my gut was telling me there was more here than a standard missing persons case. The trail was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The usual chirps, rustles, even the sound of the wind seemed muffled, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Grant seemed to notice too, but he waved it off, grumbling about city types who didn't get how quiet real wilderness could be. I might have let it go if it wasn't for a smell that hit me halfway down the trail. It was faint but unmistakable, something rotten, pungent. I slowed, glancing around for any sign of wildlife or a carcass, but the area looked undisturbed. "Smell that?" I asked Grant, hoping he'd confirm it was just some dead animal. "Dead critter, probably," he muttered. "Let's keep moving. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. If anything, it got stronger as we approached the clearing. And then, after another 100 yards, we found the campsite. The first thing that struck me was how untouched it looked. It was like a frozen snapshot. Everything as it should have been, except for the absolute silence and a lingering chill that felt unnatural. The tent was up, the sleeping bags were inside, and their supplies were scattered around, but not in a way that suggested anyone had been in a hurry. And there, just outside the tent, were the footprints Joey had mentioned. They weren't just footprints. They were deep impressions, larger than any I'd ever seen. Grant crouched down, poking at one with the end of his flashlight. "Hiker with big boots, I'm telling you," he said. But he didn't look convinced. "Looks bigger than any boot I've seen," I replied, crouching next to him, feeling an unease that settled like lead in my gut. There was something unsettlingly precise about the prints, like whoever, or whatever had made them, had been deliberately pressing down, making sure they left a mark. We split up, circling the campsite. I found the tent flap partially open, and inside were the 2 sleeping bags. One zipped up, one open. A flashlight lay in the corner, still covered in mud. I clicked it on, half expecting it not to work, but it flickered weakly to life. It was covered in something sticky and dark. I stared, unwilling to jump to conclusions, but it was hard to ignore the possibility that it was blood. "Grant," I called out, keeping my voice steady. He came over, peering in. His face hardened. "I've seen enough of these things, Brian," he said, voice low. "Kids get themselves hurt out here, or worse. You play with the wild. It plays back." "Sure," I muttered, barely listening. I clicked the flashlight off and set it aside, then glanced over at the edge of the campsite where I noticed something strange. There was a small mound of sticks and stones, oddly deliberate, almost like a marker of some kind. It was the only thing that didn't fit the careless camper vibe, and I couldn't shake the feeling it was meant to be found. Kneeling down, I reached out, intending to brush the mound aside, but Grant grabbed my wrist. "Don't," he said, his grip surprisingly firm. "Look, whatever they were doing here, it's done now. No need to mess with it." I looked at him, surprised by his intensity, but I let it go. "You think they were just out here having fun and got lost?" I asked, feeling the absurdity of the suggestion. But Grant's face remained unreadable. He shrugged and muttered, "People come out here and sometimes they don't come back. Simple as that." Something about his tone sent a chill through me. This wasn't the first case like this he'd seen. Of that I was certain. We spent another hour scouring the campsite, finding only more bizarre details. 2 water bottles, both half empty, abandoned clothes, neatly folded but stashed under rocks, and a compass that didn't point north. By the time the sun began its descent, Grant was getting antsy, insisting we head back. But my gut told me I couldn't just leave. I didn't know what it was, but I felt like I was standing on the edge of something far darker than any routine missing persons case. "Stay back," I told him, my voice edged with a resolve I hadn't intended. He looked at me, puzzled, but stayed quiet as I took a few steps toward the mound. It felt like the temperature dropped. My breaths came out in visible puffs. Grant's face shifted. He was scared. I could tell. But I ignored him, reaching out to brush aside the sticks and stones. And then I found it. A crude symbol scratched into the ground beneath the mound. It was simple but unsettling. 2 interlocking circles with a slash through the center. I'd never seen anything like it, but it felt ancient, wrong. I snapped a photo, then turned to Grant. "Have you seen this before?" He shook his head, but there was a hesitation that told me he wasn't being honest. "What is it, Grant?" I demanded. "Just a symbol. Some of the locals think it's for protection," he said, voice low. He looked around as if expecting something to burst out of the trees. "Folks who know better avoid these spots." He turned, walking back toward the truck, muttering under his breath about cursed places and idiots tempting fate. I let him go, standing alone in the eerie quiet, staring at the mark. I couldn't shake the sense that I'd uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. And then, just as I was turning to leave, I heard it. A faint cry echoing through the trees coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I froze, trying to pinpoint the direction, but it seemed to come from all around me, like the sound was bending with the trees. Against every ounce of reason, I started toward it. The forest grew denser, darker, as I moved farther from the campsite. The trail twisted, the roots clawing at my feet, branches snagging my clothes. And then, just ahead, I spotted something. A tattered piece of fabric caught on a branch. It looked like it had been there for weeks. I grabbed it, feeling the coarse fabric under my fingers. But before I could inspect it closer, the cry came again. This time louder, more urgent. I took off running, pushing through the undergrowth, the smell of decay growing stronger. I stumbled into a clearing, and that's when I saw them. The 2 missing campers, or what was left of them, lay sprawled across the ground, their bodies mangled and half buried in the dirt. I choked back a gasp, realizing too late that I wasn't alone. A figure stood on the far side of the clearing, half hidden in shadow. Tall. Gaunt. Dressed in a makeshift robe pieced together from scraps of cloth. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me, cold and calculating, looking for something. His voice was a rasp, low and cruel. They wanted to know the secrets of this place, he said, stepping closer. But some things aren't meant for the curious. In a flash, he lunged, his hand grabbing for something in his robe. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and bolted, crashing through the forest, heart pounding, lungs burning. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps fast, relentless. But just as he closed in, I spotted the faint glow of Grant's truck up ahead. I stumbled out of the woods, practically throwing myself against the side of the vehicle, pounding on the door. Grant flung it open, eyes wide. What the hell? Go. Go. Now. He didn't hesitate, slamming his foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward as we sped down the mountain road. I didn't look back, didn't breathe until the forest was a distant blur. Grant drove me back to town without a word. When we finally stopped, I turned to him, my voice hoarse. That symbol. What does it mean? He hesitated, his gaze dark. They call it the mark of the seeker. Those who wear it, they aren't like you or me. They're not bound by the same rules. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. I'd come out here looking for answers, and all I'd found was a darkness I couldn't explain. The next day, the sheriff's office found nothing at the campsite. The bodies were gone, the symbol erased like it had never been there. But I knew what I'd seen. And somehow, I knew I'd barely scratched the surface of whatever secret lay hidden in those woods. I've always loved the quiet. That's the real reason I camp alone and hike alone. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about the silence. The kind of silence that presses against you like a weight, smoothing out the chaos of everyday life. Out here, far from deadlines and the blaring traffic, I can hear my own thoughts. But it's a fragile thing, the peace that the wilderness offers. I've learned that the quiet can also play tricks on you, turn on you. That's what happened to me in the San Juan National Forest. I'd been camping alone plenty of times before, but this trip was different. I still have trouble putting it into words. All I know is that the silence stopped being my friend somewhere on the second day. I'd planned to be out there for 4 days, just long enough to clear my head and reset. The spot I'd picked was remote, a stretch of dense forest near Pagosa Springs that even the locals didn't visit often. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went like it always does. The drive up was uneventful, and after a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect campsite. It was tucked away by a creek, surrounded by towering pines, with a small clearing just big enough for my tent and fire pit. I felt that familiar rush of excitement as I set up camp. The freedom of being out here completely alone, with nothing but wilderness around me. That first night was easy. I sat by the fire, listening to the water rush over the rocks in the creek. I wrote in my journal a bit, mostly just notes about the hike and some thoughts about work. Then I crawled into my tent, ready to sleep. The silence was comforting at first, as it always is, but I woke up in the middle of the night to something strange. It was subtle. Just a faint whispering sound, like the wind picking up through the trees. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, things started to go wrong. I woke up later than I'd planned, the sky already a pale blue overhead. My stove was acting up, which was weird because it had worked fine the night before. It just wouldn't light, no matter what I tried. I ended up eating cold granola and packing up my camp, ready to move deeper into the forest. That's when I noticed my GPS wasn't working. I'd had reception when I camped here before, but now my phone was useless. No signal at all. I wasn't worried yet, though. I'd brought a map, and I knew the area well enough to navigate without technology. Still, the feeling that something wasn't right settled in, and I couldn't shake it. The hike was harder than I expected. My legs felt heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds or the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, but today it was just still. The silence felt unnatural. I found another campsite by late afternoon, a little farther into the woods, next to a meadow that looked untouched. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going, but as I worked, the feeling of being watched crept up on me. I couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, nothing was there, just trees and shadows, but the sensation wouldn't leave. That night, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and they weren't random. They were saying something, My name. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, that drifting on the breeze from somewhere just beyond the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shone the light into the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, the fire flickering in the corner of my vision. I stood there for a long time, listening, but the whispering had stopped. It was just the wind. It had to be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept much the night before, and the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. My gear wasn't cooperating either. When I tried to pack up my tent, I found that the poles had bent. They were new, barely used, but somehow they were warped, like something had twisted them while I slept. It didn't make sense. The whispering was back too, even during the day. It followed me as I hiked, a faint sound on the edge of hearing, like someone walking just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone out here. Then there was the whistling. It started around midday, just after I'd set up my third camp. At first, I thought it was a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, a high, clear note that echoed through the trees. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I called out, hoping it was another hiker, someone who'd stumbled across my camp, but there was no response, just silence. I tried to stay calm, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Now, it felt like something was circling me, just beyond my vision, waiting. That night, the whispers didn't stop. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening as the sound of my name drifted through the trees. It was faint at first, like it had been the night before, but as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent. Dylan. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I scanned the trees, heart racing, but there was nothing, just darkness. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too big to be an animal, and it was moving too deliberately, like it was watching me, waiting. I turned off my flashlight and backed into the tent, my mind racing. I'd never been this scared in the woods before, not once in all the years I'd camped alone. But now, there was something out there. I could feel it. I zipped the tent shut and tried to calm my breathing, but the whispers were inside my head now. They weren't just outside. They were all around me. Dylan, Dylan. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent, clutching the flashlight, listening as the whispers circled me. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, sometimes several, but it was always the same soft, insistent calling of my name. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care where I was going anymore, I just needed to get out of these woods. But as I started hiking, the whistling began again. This time, it was closer, following me like something was walking just behind me, whistling a slow, eerie tune. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to see whatever it was. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I was practically running down the trail. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned around. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, and its lips were curled into a grin. It stood there, staring at me, its head cocked to the side as if amused. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whistling had stopped, and now there was only silence. A silence so thick it pressed down on me like a weight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually I turned and ran. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead where my car was parked. When I finally looked back, the figure was gone. I never told anyone what happened in the San Juan National Forest. Not really. I tried to explain it to myself a 1,000 different ways. Exhaustion, anxiety, maybe even altitude sickness. But none of that explains the whispers, or the whistling, or the figure that watched me from the trees. I haven't been camping since. My name is Nathan Matthews, and in the summer of 2000, I found myself parked along a shaded bend of the Lewis River just outside the small town of Cougar, Washington. I'd planned an escape from the corporate life in Portland. It was supposed to be simple: 3 days to recharge, maybe catch some trout, and fall asleep to the quiet of the woods in that RV I bought off a guy in a Costco parking lot. It might not have been luxurious, but it did the trick. This getaway, though, would make me wish I'd gone to a beach instead. The first night was quiet enough. I made myself a lousy meal from a tin can, watched the fire die out, and sat there just listening. After years of cubicles and screen time, just hearing crickets was like a balm. Then, around midnight, I heard something else. A low rustling sound, like someone shifting leaves around. I brushed it off as a deer or raccoon and got back to my beer. But the noise came closer, staying just outside the glow of my fire. I wasn't about to get spooked by forest critters though, so I headed inside, locked the RV, and settled in for the night. When morning came, things looked pretty normal, except for a strange pile of rocks stacked just outside my door. I'm not talking about little pebbles, but fist-sized stones arranged in a way that felt oddly deliberate. I laughed it off, figuring some teens thought they'd mess with the clueless city guy. I kicked the rocks aside and went fishing. But when I came back a few hours later, the pile was right back there, stacked even higher. I'm not one for superstitions, but that second pile of rocks unsettled me a bit. I half expected to see some local kids running out from the bushes laughing at their prank, but there was no one. I decided to leave it alone and chalked it up to a weird forest quirk or an overactive squirrel. By sunset, though, my nerves were on edge. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked at the door, that pile seemed bigger in my mind. The second night started much like the first, except my stomach was tight with this gnawing sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After dinner, I put out the fire and decided to keep the lights low inside the RV, figuring that if anyone was messing with me, I'd get a chance to catch them by surprise. That's when I saw movement in the shadows by the riverbank, just a flicker of something shifting behind the trees. I cracked open the window, listening. Silence. But then came that same leaf rustling sound, only louder this time and heavier, like footsteps trying to stay hidden. I cursed myself for not bringing anything stronger than a Swiss Army knife. I'd been too confident, or maybe just too naive, to think I'd need real protection out here. About an hour passed in tense quiet, my eyes darting between the window and the shadows outside. Then, just when I thought I was losing it, I saw him. A figure, tall, gaunt, dressed in a grimy jacket and holding something that looked like an axe. He moved slowly as if he knew exactly how to stay hidden, but wanted to make sure I'd seen him, just enough to keep me guessing. I wasn't about to play his game. I grabbed keys, planning to crank up the RV and get the hell out of there. But when I reached the driver's seat, I noticed the tires. Both front tires had been slashed. My heart pounded as I forced myself to think. He was out there, and he'd clearly planned this. I decided to turn all the lights off, lock the doors, and sit low, hoping he'd get bored and leave. The minutes crawled by, and I could hear him pacing around, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel just outside. At one point he stopped, and I heard a soft tapping on the window, like he was checking if I was inside. And then he started laughing. A low, guttural chuckle that sent a chill through me. The laugh was calm, like he knew he had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. I was a city guy in an RV with slashed tires, miles from anyone who would hear me scream. I'd never felt so exposed, so helpless. Hours passed. At some point, the tapping and pacing stopped, but I was too scared to check outside. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, dawn was filtering through the thin RV curtains, casting a weak light on the chaos around me. My camp chairs were overturned, my fishing rod bent and snapped in two. There was mud smeared in thick lines across the windows, like he'd dragged his hands all over them, leaving these thick, dark smudges. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, but I steeled myself and opened the door. The rocks were there again, stacked up to chest height this time, right in front of the RV. But now they had something resting on top of them. A rusty old hatchet with dark stains on the blade. The sight of it made my stomach churn. Whoever he was, He wanted me to know he wasn't just playing around anymore. I stumbled back into the RV, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, even if it meant trekking through the woods to find help. I grabbed a backpack, loaded it with water, a map, and the Swiss Army knife, and took one last look outside. The morning was still and eerily quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As I stepped out, something caught my eye. A scrap of cloth snagged on a nearby branch. It looked like a piece of that filthy jacket the man had been wearing. I didn't want to follow the trail, but it was the only lead I had. So I steeled myself and headed in that direction. The path twisted and wound deeper into the woods, and I could feel the air grow colder, the trees pressing in on all sides. After what felt like hours, I came upon a clearing with an old, dilapidated shack. The door was slightly ajar, and a rancid smell seeped out, filling the clearing with a sickly stench that made me gag. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, heart pounding, every nerve screaming at me to turn back. But there was something inside, a figure barely visible in the gloom. It was him, sitting on a rickety chair, cradling something in his lap, a cracked, worn journal. He didn't move, didn't look up, just kept flipping through the pages, muttering under his breath. I took a step back, but something crunched under my foot, a broken bone, splintered and scattered across the floor. My eyes adjusted and I saw them, rows and rows of bones, arranged in patterns around the room like some kind of macabre decoration. My heart hammered as he looked up, his eyes dark, cold, and utterly devoid of life. He stood, holding that rusted hatchet. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Branches whipped at my face and rocks tore at my shoes, but I kept running, fueled by sheer terror. When I finally burst through the trees back to my RV, I didn't waste a second. I threw the backpack inside, climbed in, and locked every door and window I could. That hatchet was gone from the pile of rocks, and I didn't dare think about what he'd intended with it. As I sat there trying to calm my breathing, I caught sight of a small scrap of paper wedged under my windshield wiper. With trembling hands, I opened the door and grabbed it. The note was scrawled in a barely legible hand. "This isn't over." I'd later find out from a local ranger that a man fitting his description had a record, a twisted history of stalking and tormenting campers in the area, using those rocks and bones as markers, warning signs. They'd tried catching him before, but he was always one step ahead. The ranger told me he went by a name I'll never forget, Evan Calder. The kind of nightmare you don't just walk away from. My name is Mary Bryant. I'm 33 years old, and this happened last October in Blackwater Falls State Park, West Virginia. I had just landed my first solo freelance assignment, a travel feature for an outdoor magazine. It was my chance to prove to myself, and maybe to a few others, that I could thrive on my own after leaving a toxic relationship. I didn't expect the park's breathtaking beauty to be marred by whispers of the past, or that those whispers would grow louder with each passing night. When I first arrived, the park was everything I'd hoped for. My RV fit snugly into a secluded campsite overlooking the gorge, the roar of the falls constant in the distance. Blackwater Falls was a photographer's dream. Cascading water, mist rising through the gorge, and vibrant autumn foliage painted in fiery reds and oranges. The first day was perfect. I hiked, shot hundreds of photos, and scribbled notes about the trails and wildlife. The peace and quiet were a balm, exactly what I needed after months of turmoil. That evening, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and scrolling through my shots. That's when I saw it for the first time. At the edge of one frame, a figure stood between two trees. It was a man, his clothes ragged and his face shattered. I frowned, zooming in, but the details remained blurred. I didn't remember seeing anyone during my hike, and the figure hadn't appeared in any other photos. I shook it off as an optical illusion, probably a trick of light and shadows, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second day brought strange encounters. I started the morning by stopping at the visitor center, hoping to get some local insight. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, was friendly, but seemed to be watching me too closely. She eyed my camera gear and smiled knowingly. "Planning to photograph the falls?" she asked. "That's the idea," I replied. Maggie hesitated, her smile faltering. "Be careful around the falls, especially near dusk. The dead don't like company. I blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Before I could ask more, she turned to help another guest, leaving me with a vague unease. Later on a trail to the falls, I ran into Gary, a park ranger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a genial demeanor. As he gave me a quick overview of the park's history, I brought up Maggie's warning. He chuckled. Oh, that's just local folklore. Back in the Civil War, there was a Confederate soldier who hid out in the gorge. They say he deserted his regiment and was hunted down near the falls. Some folks claim his spirit never left, but I've worked here for years and never seen a thing. I tried to laugh with him, but his words stayed with me. That evening, the first real sign of something unnatural occurred. I set up my tripod near the falls, hoping to capture the golden hour light. As I framed the shot, my breath caught. The air around me had turned frigid, my breath fogging in front of me despite the mild weather. My camera refused to focus, the lens shuddering as if something was blocking it. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard whispers. I spun around, expecting to see other hikers, but I was alone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and indecipherable, like a crowd speaking just out of earshot. The unease became unbearable, and I packed up in a rush, leaving the falls as the last light of day faded. That night, back at the RV, I reviewed the day's photos. Most were stunning. The falls bathed in warm golden light, but in 3 of them, the figure from the previous day appeared again. This time he was closer, standing at the edge of the water. His face was clearer now, pale, gaunt, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been. And in the last photo, he was staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut and locked the RV door. The next morning, I debated cutting the trip short, but a part of me couldn't let it go. I'd always prided myself on being rational, and I wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences ruin my assignment. While hiking near the falls, I noticed an overgrown side trail. Curiosity tugged at me, and I followed it, ducking beneath low-hanging branches. It led to a clearing where the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. In the center of the clearing was a patch of disturbed earth, as though something had been buried there long ago. Nearby, I found an object half buried in the dirt, a weathered leather journal. The pages were brittle but legible. Written in a looping, old-fashioned script, the entries told the story of a Confederate soldier who had deserted his regiment and fled into the gorge. His words were filled with fear and desperation. The nights grow colder and I hear them coming. I cannot outrun my fate, the last entry read. They will find me tonight. I will not see another sunrise. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive feeling returned. The RV's lights flickered, and shadows danced across the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the firelight outside. And then I saw him. The soldier stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. He didn't move, didn't blink, but his hollow eyes locked onto mine. My chest tightened with fear as I realized he wasn't alone. Shadows emerged from the trees, darker and more twisted. Their forms writhing like smoke, they whispered accusations, voices overlapping in a cacophony. Traitor. Coward. You will not leave. Panicking, I grabbed the journal and held it up. Is this what you want? I shouted. The soldier's expression shifted, sadness, perhaps gratitude, and he gestured toward the disturbed earth I'd seen earlier. I understood. Clutching the journal, I ran back to the clearing. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. My hands shook as I placed the journal on the grave and whispered a quiet prayer for peace. The air around me grew still. The shadows stopped, their forms dissolving into the night. The soldier lingered for a moment longer, his hollow eyes softening, before fading into the mist. By morning, the oppressive feeling had lifted. The forest seemed brighter, the air lighter, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Before leaving, I stopped at the visitor center to return the journal. Maggie was there, her knowing smile greeting me. You helped him, didn't you? She asked, her voice soft. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She reached out, patting my hand. He's free now. You did a good thing. As I drove away from Blackwater Falls, I realized the experience had changed me. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer felt the weight of doubt and fear that had followed me into the park. Sometimes the past lingers in ways we can't explain, and sometimes all it takes to move forward is to lay it to rest. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I had heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one that locals said disappeared and reappeared as though it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it and film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera and set it up, filming a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on the damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket, just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore were fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in symbols, strange spiraling shapes that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving, the trees closing in tighter. The trail I was following became fainter, more overgrown, and soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping my camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment there had been a clear path, and now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The mist curled around the trees, thick and almost suffocating, but I was certain I'd been on the right trail. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed that I was in the middle of nowhere, no path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, standing alone in the fog. Okay, I muttered. You've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. Hey, I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. You lost too? The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. I've been walking for days, he said, his voice hoarse. The trail, it keeps changing. Are you okay? I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. No one's okay out here. I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. What do you mean? The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path, it's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave. I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. Look, I said, pulling out my GPS. We can find our way back. The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. It won't help. The forest is messing with it. I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get him some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago was now choked with brambles. When I looked back, the trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us. The forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around as though he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whispers growing louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange, shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting, somewhere in the mist, for me to return. My name's Jerry Bryant, and back in 2016, I decided to try RV camping around the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The place was lush and remote, the kind of spot where a guy can breathe and think about life without a soul nearby. I'd had enough of the city grind, finance, endless spreadsheets, and people who look past you like you didn't even exist. So I borrowed my cousin's old RV and set out, hoping the UP would be the answer to my midlife crisis. Turns out, I got way more than I bargained for. I pulled into a spot that was tucked into the woods, right by the shores of Lake Superior. It felt like I'd hit the jackpot. Water lapping against rocks, a towering forest around me, and nothing but space. I parked the RV, pulled out a lawn chair, and settled in with a six-pack. A few hours of peace later, a rusty red truck pulled into the campground a few hundred yards away, and an older guy got out. He looked like he'd stepped out of an old Wild West film, down to his worn-out hat and the belt buckle big enough to stop a bullet. I was all about meeting locals, so I figured I'd say, "Hey, name's Jerry," I said, strolling over with a grin. He sized me up, grunted, and looked back at the lake. "You're on Blackwood land," he said flatly, with zero enthusiasm. "These woods don't take kindly to strangers." That gave me a chuckle, but his stare stayed cold. I made some small talk, asking about the best hiking trails and fishing spots, but his responses were clipped, his eyes darting around like he was looking for something or someone. He introduced himself as Eli Ward, a name as gritty as the man himself. "City boy like you wouldn't get it," he said finally before getting in his truck and driving off without another word. I shrugged it off and went back to my RV, ready to kick back for the night. But around midnight, I heard a strange noise, something between a scream and a howl echoing from deep in the woods. I tried to convince myself it was just a fox or maybe a coyote, but the sound was too human. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, wondering if this was some kind of local prank. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight and a map, and decided to take a hike deeper into the woods, figuring I'd explore while the sun was up. About a mile in, I stumbled across a small, weathered shack, barely standing. The place looked like it had seen one too many Michigan winters, walls peeling, windows cracked, and the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. That's when I saw the marks, deep, carved scratches in the doorframe, like someone or something had raked its nails across it. As I peered through one of the cracked windows, I saw a set of photographs taped to the wall inside, a collage of strangers, their faces worn and faded with time. And there, in the middle of the arrangement, was a photo of Eli. My heart skipped a beat. It was like a weird homemade shrine. But what bothered me most was that every face seemed to have something scratched into the photo's surface, a date. I didn't stick around to study it further. I hightailed it back to the RV, locking the doors behind me, feeling every single step echoing back through those trees. My head was racing with questions. Why was Eli's photo in that shack? Who were the other people? And what were those dates? Around nightfall, I sat in the RV, nursing another beer, but the feeling of unease hadn't left me. I must have dozed off at some point, but I was jolted awake by a loud thud on the side of the RV. I grabbed the flashlight, heart pounding, and swung open the door. There, at the base of the RV, was a heap of something wrapped in old, moldy blankets. It took me a second to realize it was a body. The smell hit me first, a rancid, sickly sweet stench that clawed at my throat. I stumbled back, covering my mouth, the beam of my flashlight casting an eerie glow on a face staring back at me, wide-eyed and unmoving. It was the face of one of the people from that wall in the shack. Panicked, I scrambled back inside, locking the doors, though I knew that wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get in. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, but there was no service. The woods around me were silent, so thick with quiet that every creak of the RV felt like a gunshot. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. An hour must have passed before I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. My heart hammered as I peeked out of a small window, and there he was, Eli, standing in the shadows, just watching. He had a grin on his face, but his eyes looked empty, hollow, as though there was nothing human left behind them. With a smirk, he called out, "See? Blackwood doesn't like strangers." That's when I realized Eli wasn't just some local eccentric. He was something else. He was something else, something twisted. I had to get out of there, but moving would mean risking him hearing me. I crouched there, holding my breath as he circled the RV, humming some tune that sounded like an old folk song. He kept muttering to himself, just loud enough for me to hear bits and pieces. "Strangers don't last long, this is Blackwood's way." Then his voice grew louder, almost playful. "Don't worry, I'll keep you nice and quiet. They all stay quiet in the end." I couldn't wait anymore. I grabbed the keys, eased into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, louder than I had hoped, and Eli whipped around, his face twisted with rage. Without thinking, I slammed on the gas, barreling out of the campsite. Tree branches scraped against the sides of the RV as I navigated the narrow trail in the pitch black. He was still coming. In my rearview mirror, I saw him running after me, a figure in the dark. His speed was unnatural, like he knew these woods better than anyone. Panic surged through me as I swerved around trees, the RV groaning under the pressure. But Eli was relentless, keeping pace, barely slowing. I took a sharp turn onto a rough gravel path that I hadn't noticed before, praying it would lead me somewhere with people, or at least out of these cursed woods. Behind me, Eli's figure grew small, but the adrenaline kept me pushing forward until I hit a clearing with a rundown gas station on the edge. I jumped out of the RV and bolted inside, finding a single old attendant behind the counter, who looked up at me like I was a madman. "Eli Ward," I stammered, catching my breath. He's out there." The man's face fell and he sighed. Old Eli thought he'd been caught years back. He's not right. Lives out there, does whatever he wants to anyone who wanders too far. But folks like us, we don't go out there, son. It all hit me like a freight train. Eli wasn't some local legend. He was a real, breathing man with his own twisted history that nobody dared to touch. The locals must have known, maybe even tolerated him, as long as he didn't bother their own. Strangers, though? Well, strangers were fair game. After that night, I drove as far from the UP as I could. Didn't stop until I hit Chicago. Back in my apartment, I did some digging, found old police records and a handful of missing persons reports from years back. But nothing ever came of them. No bodies, no suspects. They were just gone. They said he was a war vet, someone who came back and never quite fit back into society, maybe didn't want to. But whatever he was, those woods had made him something worse, something that thrived on the isolation, the silence, and the blood of anyone who dared to trespass. And I had almost been one of them. It started like any other day, but by the end, I knew I'd never look at fishing the same way again. My name's Curtis Langford. Back in 1984, I had a pretty laid-back life in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I was one of those guys who found solace in the quietude of nature, and fishing was my escape from the hustle of daily life. It wasn't about the fish, it was about the peace. One summer day, I packed up my gear and headed out to the Wapsipinicon River, a spot far enough from town to feel like another world. I always went alone. It's not that I didn't have friends, I just valued the solitude. My wife, Linda, always joked that I was part fish myself, given how much time I spent by the water. The day was off to a perfect start. The sun was high, the water was calm, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional plop of a fish breaking the surface. I set up my spot under a big oak tree, casting my line and settling into my favorite old chair, one that had seen better days but held too many memories to replace. A couple of hours passed uneventfully, and I had just reeled in a decent-sized bass when I noticed something odd across the river, where the dense forest started. I saw movement. It wasn't the typical flutter of leaves or the scamper of a squirrel. It was something larger, something that seemed to blend with the shadows, moving with a strange, jerky rhythm. I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably a deer. I'd seen plenty of them around these parts, but then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to focus on my fishing, but my mind kept drifting back to the forest. By noon, I decided to take a break and have some lunch. As I was munching on a sandwich, I heard a rustle from behind me. I turned quickly, half expecting to see a raccoon or maybe another fisherman, but there was nothing. Just the wind. I told myself, just the wind. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural noise that seemed to vibrate through the air. It wasn't quite a growl, more like a deep, primal sound that I felt in my bones. I stood up, scanning the area, but everything was still. My heart was pounding now, and I was on edge. I decided to call it a day. I began packing my gear when I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the leaves behind me. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a bear, but as it stepped out from the shadows, I realized this was no ordinary animal. It was massive, easily standing over 7 feet tall, with matted fur and eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. Its limbs were long and twisted, and its face was a grotesque blend of human and beast, with sharp, uneven teeth and a snout that twitched as it sniffed the air. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my tackle box where I kept a small knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The creature stepped closer, its eyes locked on me, and I could see intelligence in those eyes, a cunning that chilled me to the core. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a chilling sound, somewhere between a laugh and a snarl, and lunged toward me. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard. The knife slipped from my hand, skidding across the ground. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline fueling my every move, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me. I ran toward the river, hoping to lose it in the water. As I reached the bank, I glanced back and saw it tearing through my fishing spot, tossing my chair aside like it was nothing. I plunged into the river, the cold water shocking my system. I swam for the opposite bank, my limbs burning from the effort. When I reached the other side, I hauled myself onto the shore and collapsed, gasping for breath. I looked back, expecting to see the creature following, but it had stopped at the water's edge. It paced back and forth, its eyes never leaving me. It seemed almost hesitant, as if the water was a barrier it couldn't cross. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then it let out another eerie noise and turned back toward the forest, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I picked myself up and ran toward the road, my wet clothes clinging to me, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached my truck, I jumped in and locked the doors, as if that would keep the monster at bay. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the ignition. I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I parked in front of a diner and sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. I wanted to tell someone, but who would believe me? It sounded like something out of a horror movie. Eventually, I went inside and ordered a coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I sat there, the events replayed in my mind over and over. That's when I saw him, a man sitting at the counter, staring at me. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days, and there was a haunted look in his eyes. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, my mouth dry. "Saw what?" "The beast," he said. "It lives in the forest, feeds on anything that crosses its path." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You've seen it?" He nodded. "Lost my brother to it. No one believed me." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" He shook his head. "Don't know. Some kind of monster. Some say it's a curse. Others think it's an experiment gone wrong. All I know is it's real, and it's dangerous." We talked for a while, exchanging stories. He told me about the disappearances, the strange noises, the sightings that had been brushed off as myths or hallucinations. It felt surreal, like I was in some kind of nightmare. As the day wore on, I decided to head home. Linda was worried sick, and I didn't want to scare her with the truth. I told her I'd had an accident, fell into the river. She fussed over me, making sure I was okay, and I did my best to act normal. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching me. I kept seeing its face, hearing that chilling noise. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares. The next morning, I decided to go back. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to see if it was real, if I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. I told Linda I was going fishing again, and she gave me a worried look but didn't say anything. I drove back to the river, my heart pounding the whole way. When I reached my spot, everything was as I'd left it. My chair was overturned, my gear scattered, but there was no sign of the creature. I spent the day there, watching, waiting. I didn't fish. I didn't even unpack my gear. I just sat there, listening, looking for any sign of movement. But nothing happened. By the time the sun started to set, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Maybe it was a one-time thing, I told myself. Maybe it had moved on, or maybe it had been a trick of the light, my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I packed up and headed home, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes. When I got home, Linda was waiting for me. She could tell something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. I didn't want her to worry. Didn't want to put her through the same fear I was feeling. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise outside, a low rumbling sound that sent a chill down my spine. I got up, grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed, and went to the window. There in the yard, I saw it, the creature, standing by the edge of the woods, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was watching me just like before. I felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of determination. I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let it take over my life. I had to do something. I went to the garage, grabbed a flashlight, and headed outside. The creature didn't move, just watched me with those eerie eyes. I shone the light on it, hoping to scare it off, but it just stood there, unmoving. "Get out of here," I shouted, waving the bat. "Leave us alone." For a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then it turned and disappeared into the woods. I stood there, breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. When I went back inside, Linda was waiting for me. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. I shook my head. "Just a raccoon," I lied. "Nothing to worry about." She didn't believe me, but she didn't press the issue. We went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, any sign that it was coming back. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt those eyes on me. I tried to go about my life, tried to act normal, but it was always there, in the back of my mind. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch, I saw a figure approaching. It was the man from the diner, the one who had lost his brother. He looked even worse than before, his eyes haunted. "You have to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "It won't stop. It will keep coming after you." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "The creature," he said. "It's marked you. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What does it want?" He shook his head. "I don't know. But you have to leave. Get as far away from here as you can." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was crazy, but deep down I knew he was right. I could feel it. The sense of impending doom, the fear that had taken over my life. That night, I told Linda everything. She listened, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't doubt me. We packed up our things and left that very night, driving as far away as we could. We ended up in a small town in Colorado, hoping that the distance would keep us safe. For a while, it seemed to work. We started to rebuild our lives, trying to put the past behind us. But I never forgot. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes. And sometimes late at night, I would hear that noise, that low rumbling sound that haunted my dreams. Years passed, and we tried to move on. We had kids, built a life, but the fear never completely went away. I told myself it was over, that we were safe. But deep down, I knew better. And then one day, I saw it again. We were out for a hike, the kids running ahead when I saw movement in the trees. I froze, my heart pounding, and there it was, watching me with those same glowing eyes. I knew then that it would never stop, that it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. It had marked me, and there was no escape. We moved again, trying to stay ahead of it, but it always found us. No matter where we went, no matter how far we ran, it was always there, a constant reminder of that day by the river. I don't know what it wants or why it's after me, but I do know one thing. I will never stop fighting. I will never let it win. This is my story, a story of fear and survival, of a creature that haunts my every step. And though I don't know how it will end, I do know one thing. I will never give up. I will keep fighting, keep running until my last breath. Because that's what it means to be human, to fight to survive, no matter the odds. It started on a pretty typical Monday in 2010 in the backwoods of Dunsmuir, California. My name's Samuel Ford, and I don't usually get involved in stuff like this. I'm more of a live and let live kind of guy, you know? Anyway, it all kicked off when I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. I was dealing with some personal stuff, nothing major, just the usual life's got you down kind of crap. So there I was, wandering through the trees, thinking about everything and nothing. The morning was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. Dunsmuir is known for its rugged beauty, lots of trees, rivers, and peace. Perfect for someone needing to get lost in their thoughts. I was halfway up one of the lesser-known trails when I spotted it. a cabin I hadn't seen before. Now, I've hiked these trails for years, and never once did I come across this place. I wasn't armed, just had a Swiss Army knife and a lot of curiosity. What's a guy like me going to do with a gun anyway? The cabin looked old, almost like it had been there for decades. The wood was weathered, windows covered in grime. There was no path leading to it, which was odd. Maybe it was abandoned. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I stepped onto the creaky porch and gave it a gentle push. It swung open with a long, eerie creak. I'm not the type to go snooping around other people's property, but this place seemed forgotten. Inside, it was dark and musty, filled with old furniture draped in dust sheets. The whole vibe was straight out of a horror movie, but I wasn't scared, more intrigued than anything. I wandered through the rooms, noticing old photographs on the walls, black and white, mostly of landscapes and a few people. One picture caught my eye. It was of a family standing right outside this cabin. They looked happy, but something about their eyes gave me the creeps. Just then, I heard it. A faint shuffling noise coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. Common sense would tell anyone to get the hell out of there. But me? I decided to investigate. I slowly climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight. At the top, the noise was clearer, like someone dragging something across the floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from a cracked window at the end. I followed the sound to a closed door on the right. I hesitated, hand hovering over the knob, then, summoning whatever courage I had, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, probably a kid's room once upon a time. There were toys scattered around, an old bed against the wall, and there in the middle of the room was a figure hunched over something on the floor. It was big, covered in what looked like fur. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It turned around slowly, revealing a face that was more animal than human. A snout, sharp teeth, but humanoid eyes staring right through me. Before I could react, it lunged at me. I managed to sidestep, but not before it raked its claws across my arm. The pain was sharp, intense. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding arm. The creature snarled and came at me again. This time I was ready. I grabbed a wooden chair and swung it with all my might. It shattered against the creature's head, stunning it for a moment. I took my chance and bolted, out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the cabin. My mind was racing. What the hell was that thing? I had to get out of there, warn someone. I ran down the trail, blood dripping from my arm. The adrenaline kept me going, but I knew I needed to get help soon. I reached the trailhead and jumped into my truck. I sped down the dirt road toward town, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I burst into the sheriff's office, babbling about the creature and the cabin. Sheriff Maxwell, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense attitude, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Samuel, you sure you didn't just spook yourself?" he asked, eyeing my bloody arm. "I'm telling you, Max, there's something out there. It's not human. It attacked me," I insisted, my voice shaking. He sighed and grabbed his radio. "All right, let's go take a look." We drove back to the cabin, me in the passenger seat, clutching my makeshift bandage. Maxwell didn't say much, probably thinking I was crazy. When we arrived, the place looked just as eerie as before. I led him to the room where I'd seen the creature. The door was still open, but the room was empty. No sign of the creature, just blood. My blood on the floor. Maxwell looked around, frowning. "Whatever you saw, it's gone now. But we can't just leave it at that. We need to find out what's going on." We spent the rest of the day searching the area, finding nothing. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was it all a hallucination? Wouldn't try, but the pain in my arm and the blood said otherwise. Maxwell decided to call in some experts, figuring it might be a wild animal, though I knew it was something far more sinister. Later that evening, as we sat in the sheriff's office, a man walked in. He was tall, with a rugged face and piercing eyes. Introduced himself as Dr. Leon Voss, an anthropologist specializing in cryptids and folklore. "I heard about your encounter," he said, looking at me with interest. "Mind if I ask you some questions?" We went over the details again, and he listened intently. "What you described sounds like a legend I've heard before. Locals call it the Wendigo, a creature said to be a former human who resorted to cannibalism and transformed into a beast." I shook my head. It looked like some kind of Bigfoot, but more vicious. more human. Voss nodded. The lines between myth and reality are often blurred, but I believe you saw something real, something dangerous. Over the next few hours, Voss, Maxwell, and I planned to return to the cabin at dawn. We gathered supplies, flashlights, and weapons. I borrowed a shotgun from the sheriff's armory, figuring it might even the odds. I was determined to face whatever it was, partly out of fear, but also a strange sense of responsibility. The next morning, we made our way back to the cabin. The woods seemed darker, more foreboding. As we approached, Voss motioned for us to stay quiet. We moved silently, weapons at the ready. Inside, the cabin was just as we left it, but something felt off, a heaviness in the air. We split up, each taking a different part of the house. I went back upstairs, heart pounding in my chest. The kids' room was still empty, but I felt like I was being watched. Suddenly, a crash from downstairs sent me running back. I found Voss and Maxwell in the living room, staring at a broken window. "It's here," Voss whispered, clutching a flashlight and a pistol. "Stay close." We moved outside, scanning the tree line. Then we saw it, the creature, lurking at the edge of the woods. It stood there, watching us with those unnerving eyes. I raised my shotgun, but Voss put a hand on my arm. "Wait, let's see what it does." The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It sniffed the air, then let out a low, guttural snarl. Without warning, it charged. Maxwell fired, hitting it in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. It was on us in seconds. I fired my shotgun, the blast echoing through the trees. The creature recoiled, blood spraying from its side. Voss shouted, "Keep firing," as he unloaded his pistol into the beast. Maxwell reloaded his rifle, taking aim. The creature lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. I struggled to keep it at bay, its claws tearing at my clothes. Just as it went for my throat, Maxwell's rifle cracked and the creature slumped to the ground, dead. I lay there, breathing hard, staring at the lifeless body. It looked even more monstrous up close, a grotesque blend of human and animal. Voss knelt beside me, checking my wounds. "You're lucky," he said, helping me to my feet. "But we need to get out of here. There might be more of them." We hurried back to the truck, leaving the cabin and its horrors behind. As we drove back to town, the reality of what happened started to sink in. Maxwell radioed for backup, and soon the area was swarming with law enforcement and wildlife experts. They found no other creatures, but the body was taken for study. My name is Gary Ellis, and it was 2020 when I found myself in the dense pines of the Cinne National Park in British Columbia. I've been a solo camper for years, but this time I decided to rent an old RV and drive as far as the roads would take me. It was supposed to be a week of fishing, hiking, and generally escaping the buzz of daily life. But, life has a way of giving you just the opposite of what you expect. I was about 3 days in when things started to get a bit strange. The first night was mostly uneventful, save for the usual creaks and groans of an RV settling in after a long drive. By the second night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near my campsite. I kept hearing crunching noises outside, like someone was slowly stepping on twigs and leaves. I dismissed it, reasoning that it was probably an animal. After all, the park was known for its wildlife. However, on the third day, I woke up to find deep footprints around the RV. Human footprints. I'm not easily spooked, but there was something unsettling about knowing someone had been outside while I was asleep, close enough to touch the door. I scanned the area, hoping to catch sight of whoever it was, but the woods were still and silent, almost unnaturally so. Later that afternoon, I decided to do a little fishing by the river to clear my head. It was about a 20-minute hike from my campsite, and I figured if there was anyone lurking nearby, I'd probably be able to spot them along the way. But I was wrong. The entire area felt abandoned, and as I cast my line, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not wanting to freak myself out, I kept my focus on the water. That's when I heard it, a soft laugh. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe even a bird, but it was too deliberate. It sent a chill down my back. I scanned the tree line, but nothing, just miles of trees standing as silent witnesses to whatever was lurking out there. Returning to my campsite, I found something that sent a jolt of panic through me. My campsite was in total disarray. The firewood I'd collected was scattered, the tarp I'd used for shade was ripped, and my belongings had been rifled through. The strangest part? Whoever did this had left a single Polaroid picture on the ground. It was a photo of me, asleep in the RV the previous night. I won't lie, I panicked. I grabbed my hatchet, the only weapon I had, and immediately started scanning the woods for any sign of movement. There was no one. Nothing but endless trees, the faint rustle of leaves, and the smell of pine. I thought about leaving right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon everything I'd brought. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound, every crackle, every gust of wind felt like a threat. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside the RV. My grip tightened on the hatchet as I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then the knock. 3 slow, steady taps on the door. I stayed silent, heart pounding, wondering if I should answer or keep quiet. The knocking stopped after a few moments and everything went silent again. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching my hatchet and listening, but the footsteps didn't return. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things, determined to get out of there before things got worse. But as I started the RV, I noticed something strange. The brake line had been cut. Whoever was out there wanted to make sure I stayed. I tried calling for help, but there was no signal. That left me with 2 options: wait for someone to pass by, which could take days, or hike out on foot and leave the RV behind. Reluctantly, I packed a bag with the essentials, took my hatchet, and started the trek down the trail, hoping I'd run into someone soon. I'd only been walking for about an hour when I heard it again. That laugh. This time it was closer and unmistakably human. I spun around, gripping the hatchet tightly, but there was no one there. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the eerie feeling crawling up my spine. The laugh followed me, echoing through the trees, taunting me. After a while, I noticed a shadow moving in my periphery. I didn't stop to look. I just kept moving, keeping my eyes on the trail. But the shadow grew closer, almost matching my pace. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and I turned around, brandishing the hatchet. There he was, a man, standing just a few feet away. He wore an old, tattered jacket and had scruffy, unkempt hair. He looked like he hadn't seen a bed or a shower in months. He stared at me with a grin, almost like he was amused by my reaction. "You lost, friend?" he asked, his voice smooth and mocking. "I'm just passing through," I said, keeping the hatchet in front of me. "Not looking for trouble." He took a step closer, unfazed by my warning. "Trouble finds everyone eventually." His words hung in the air, thick with menace. Without waiting, I turned and started walking again. Faster this time. He followed me, his footsteps crunching the leaves in a deliberate, taunting rhythm. I didn't look back, just kept moving, hoping he'd lose interest. But every time I thought I'd put some distance between us, he'd appear again, his grin widening as if he was enjoying the game. It was starting to get dark, and I knew I needed to find shelter. I stumbled upon an old ranger cabin, long abandoned and half buried in foliage. The windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges, but it was better than being out in the open. I rushed inside, slamming the door shut and wedging a broken chair against it for good measure. I waited in the silence, listening for any sign of him. Minutes passed, maybe even an hour. Just when I thought I was safe, the laughter started again, this time right outside the cabin. "You think you can hide?" His voice was barely a whisper, but I could feel it creeping under my skin. I gripped the hatchet, preparing for whatever would come next. There was a loud bang as he kicked at the door, the chair barely holding it shut. My heart raced as I backed away, realizing that I had no other way out. The banging continued, each kick growing more forceful, until the door finally gave way. He stepped inside, his grin now a full, twisted smile. "This has been fun," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I swung the hatchet, desperate and fueled by fear. He dodged, laughing, as he grabbed my arm and twisted it, forcing the hatchet from my hand. I fought back, kicking and punching, but he was stronger, fueled by whatever twisted motivation drove him. Just when I thought it was over, I managed to grab a broken piece of wood from the floor and jabbed it into his side. He let out a grunt, momentarily stunned, and I took the chance to run. I bolted out of the cabin, not looking back, my only thought to put as much distance between us as possible. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. By some miracle, a park ranger's truck was driving by, and I waved it down, breathless and panicked. The ranger took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told him about the man, the footprints, the photo, everything. He assured me they'd look into it and gave me a ride back to town. A few days later, I got a call from the ranger. They'd searched the area and found the cabin, along with something chilling. Dozens of Polaroid photos scattered across the floor. Each one showed different campers who had stayed in the park over the years. Some of them looked just like me, terrified and running. They never found the man. The road into the Adar Andax was long, winding, and empty, just how I liked it. After a few hours of driving, I pulled the RV off the narrow trail and into a small clearing by the lake. The pines stretched high and thick around me, their dark needles blending into the overcast sky. This was exactly what I needed, complete isolation. No people, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of my own thoughts. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant ripple of water. Perfect. This place would give me the quiet I craved, a chance to think without the distractions of civilian life. Ever since leaving the military, I'd been chasing peace, and this felt like it could be the spot where I'd finally find it. I grabbed my gear and went about setting up camp. It didn't take long. I'd done this enough times to know the routine: gather firewood, get a small fire going, and make sure the RV was ready for a night out in the wilderness. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye. On one of the nearby trunks, there was a strange marking, a crude carving of a figure, long and thin, etched into the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over it. Just a kid's prank, I figured. Probably a bored hiker from weeks ago. But as I moved through the forest gathering wood, I found more of them. Carved figures on the trees, all tall and slender, stretching higher than any human could reach. It was strange, but I wasn't here to think about strange things. I was here to forget. By the time the sun set, the fire was crackling softly, casting flickering light across the clearing. I settled in, next to the warmth, staring out at the darkening forest. There was a peace in the solitude, something comforting about being alone with the sounds of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no night animals scurrying about, just silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I shook my head. "You're just on edge," I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the tension building in my chest. The wilderness could play tricks on you if you let it. I knew that better than most. I was here to clear my head, not to let it run wild. But then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, just for a split second, something moved, tall, thin, just beyond the trees. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight tighter, and aimed the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. But there was nothing, only the dark outline of the pines swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But after a long moment, the rustling stopped, the trees swayed, and the forest fell back into its unsettling quiet. I forced myself to sit back down, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the nerves from the night before. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maybe if I put some distance between myself and the campsite, I could clear my head. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the trees. As I walked, I found more of the carvings on the trees, each one stranger than the last. They were everywhere. Slender, elongated figures with no faces, all staring outward, all watching. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thick enough that the sunlight barely broke through. About an hour in, I reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was stunning, endless trees stretching out below, the mountains rising in the distance. I was about to pull out my camera when I heard footsteps behind me. "Morning," a voice said. I turned to see an older man. probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. He was holding a bundle of firewood in his arms, his face weathered and sun-creased like someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, giving him a nod. "Not many people come this deep into the forest," the man replied, his voice low and rough. He looked me up and down, then glanced toward the valley. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over by the lake, trying to get some quiet." He gave me a long look, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful. This part of the Adirondacks, it's different." "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. People call it the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You see it once, and you'll start seeing it everywhere." I laughed, shaking my head. "Local ghost stories." The man didn't smile. "It's not a story. It's real. People who see the Watcher, they don't come back the same." He took a step closer. "I'm telling you this because you look like you've seen things. You know when something's not right and something's not right here." I met his gaze, feeling that familiar knot of unease tightening in my gut. "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first, and then you'll feel it." He turned, starting back down the trail. "Just don't stay too long." I watched him go, his words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as superstition, but the way he'd looked at me, like he'd seen the same thing I had last night, made it hard to dismiss. That evening back at camp, the unease was worse. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees towering higher than I remembered, the shadows deeper, darker. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and sputter, but it didn't drown out the sounds. The rustling came back, louder this time, and with it, something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the beam barely seemed to penetrate the trees. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them, but when I moved the beam, they started again. I stood, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My pulse was pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone out here. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its body was almost skeletal, its limbs too long, and its head bent slightly as if it were watching me from above. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits that stared right at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite myself. The figure didn't respond. It stayed still, silent, its form almost blending into the shadows. I raised my knife, backing toward the RV. The figure remained at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. For hours I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for the figure to move. But it never did. It just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on the RV. At dawn, the figure was gone, but the carvings had multiplied, dozens of them surrounding the campsite. The same tall, thin figures etched into the trees like a silent army. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, the carvings seemed to watch me, following me down the narrow trail, their hollow eyes staring. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the Adar, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as the trees thinned and the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Watcher was still out there, somewhere in those woods. It was still watching, and maybe it always would be. My name is Jack Bennett, and back in 2016, I decided to take my RV out to a quiet spot near the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. My wife was usually my camping partner, but she'd caught a bad flu, so I went solo. I figured I could manage a few nights alone, read a few books, and fish. My idea of the perfect downtime was no phone service, no one around, and a lake where the fish didn't mind biting. I parked the RV in a secluded spot right near a lake, and after a few hours of quiet, I felt my shoulders drop. The only sounds were the soft rush of the wind in the pines and the occasional splash in the water. I set up a few fishing lines on the edge of the lake and grabbed a beer from the cooler, sinking into my camping chair as the evening settled in. On the first night, I thought I heard something outside the RV around midnight. Just a few crunches on the gravel, like someone was walking. I figured it was an animal, a deer maybe, though I still got up and looked outside, finding nothing. Just shadows in the silent forest. I brushed it off. This wasn't my first solo camping trip, and I was used to hearing noises now and then. The second night, though, I heard it again. This time, the crunching was slower, deliberate, not the kind of sound an animal makes. I was lying in bed trying to read by flashlight, but the noise made me put down the book. I listened for a few moments, then quietly got up and out the small RV window. Standing near the edge of the clearing was a tall man. He was in his 50s, I'd guess, with gray hair and clothes that looked too clean for camping. He stood completely still, his face tilted up as if he was sniffing the air. It wasn't exactly the type of scene I expected to see on a solo camping trip, and my first thought was he was probably a ranger. I decided to step out and ask if he needed help. As I opened the door, he turned slowly toward me, and I noticed his lips twitching into what could have been a smile, or maybe a snarl. I felt my stomach tighten, but I ignored it. "Hey there," I called. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me with this fixed, unnerving look, his lips parting a little like he was tasting the air. There was something off about him, but I tried to keep things normal. You camping out here too?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Finally he spoke, and his voice was scratchy like he hadn't used it in a long time. "Got lost," he muttered, his words almost a whisper. "Been out here looking for a place to stay." I tried to keep my tone casual. "Well, there's a town about 20 miles south. I could show you the way in the morning." His eyes shifted, and for a moment I thought he'd agree, but then he looked down at my fishing gear lying on the ground by the water. "I haven't had fish in a long time," he said, his voice barely audible. It was then that I noticed his hands. They were covered in what looked like dried blood. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. I have some food in the RV," I said, inching back toward the door. "You're welcome to some if you're hungry." He took a step forward, still smiling that strange half-snarl of his. "I don't eat canned food," he said, as if that settled things. I nodded slowly, my hand reaching for the door handle. "All right then. Well, I'd best get some sleep." Before I could turn around, he took another step toward me, closer now, and his voice dropped to a raspy whisper. "What are you doing out here alone, friend?" There was something chilling in the way he said friend, as if it meant the opposite. I swallowed hard, keeping my voice steady. "Just camping. I like the quiet." He tilted his head, examining me with a strange intensity. "You're lying." My pulse hammered in my chest, but I forced a casual smile. "No, I'm just a regular guy out for some peace and quiet." His eyes narrowed, and he took another slow step forward. I knew then I needed to get back inside, lock the door, and maybe even drive off if he kept pressing closer. "All right," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "You take care now." I turned, and that's when I heard him sprint forward. Instinct kicked in, and I threw myself into the RV, slamming the door just in time to hear his fists pounding against it. The door shook, the thin walls rattling as his voice grew louder, angrier. "Let me in, friend," he screamed, his voice twisted with rage. "You think you're safe in there?" I scrambled back, locking myself in the small bathroom, listening as he tried the handle, then started circling the RV, tapping on each window, trying each latch. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, hoping he'd get bored or think better of it. But he didn't. For hours, he lingered outside, muttering to himself, his voice carrying words I couldn't quite make out. Occasionally, he'd laugh, a low, mirthless sound that sent chills down my spine. When I finally dared to peek out through a crack in the bathroom door, I saw his face inches from the window, his eyes scanning the inside of the RV as if he were hunting something or someone. Eventually, he moved back, retreating into the forest as the first light of dawn broke over the trees. I waited a full hour, my heart still hammering, before I worked up the nerve to unlock the door and step outside. I thought he was gone, but as I moved to collect my fishing gear, I found a makeshift camp hidden in the trees nearby, littered with rotting food, empty cans, and something else. Bones. Small bones. Some picked clean, others still covered in dried blood. When I looked closer, I saw something scrawled on a piece of bark near the edge of his camp. The words were carved in deep, jagged letters. One more to go. That was when I knew he hadn't just been lost. He'd been hunting, and that night, I'd been the one he'd chosen. I stumbled back from the trees, my eyes darting around the quiet, misty forest. Every crackle of a branch sounded too loud, too close. I grabbed my fishing rod, not even caring about the tackle box I'd left on the shore. I just needed to get out. I sprinted back to the RV, threw myself inside, and started the engine. The tires kicked up gravel as I tore out of the clearing. I could barely keep my hands steady on the wheel, gripping it so hard my knuckles went white. The forest blurred past me as I drove, trying to leave every trace of him behind. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. It was only then that I let myself breathe, glancing over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't somehow trailing me. When I finally pulled into the nearest town, I parked outside a diner, its lights casting a soft glow in the early morning. I didn't care about looking disheveled or that I was the only customer there before dawn. I just wanted to be around people. The waitress took one look at me and brought over a cup of coffee without even asking. "Rough night?" she asked, eyeing the scrapes on my arms from where I'd bolted through the trees. I nodded, trying to steady myself enough to take a sip. "You could say that," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me a moment, then leaned in, speaking quietly. "You're not the first. There have been stories of strange folks around those woods, folks who don't belong, who are hunting something." I felt a chill as her words echoed what I'd seen. "What do you mean, hunting?" I asked, needing to hear someone else say it out loud. She lowered her voice even more. "People go missing now and then. They don't advertise it, of course, but I've lived here long enough to know what happens. They find remnants sometimes. A piece of clothing, a broken watch, a shoe. It's never much, and it's never enough to make sense of." I could feel my pulse quicken, the bones I'd seen, the mess at his camp. It hadn't been the camp of someone lost. He'd been out there a long time, gathering pieces, marking his territory. After she left, I sat in the diner for hours, watching cars pass and wondering how close I'd come to being his next. One more to go. Finally, I got up to leave, my legs shaky but ready to be anywhere but in that booth. I paid, thanked the waitress, and made my way back to the RV. Just before I climbed in, I noticed something out of place. A small, crumpled piece of bark wedged into my windshield wiper. My stomach twisted as I reached for it, turning it over in my hand. The words were scrawled in jagged letters, just like at his camp. Just like at his camp. "I know where you are." I left that town and never looked back. Red River Gorge felt like the perfect escape. A few days surrounded by nature with no emails, no deadlines, just the wild and my camera. I needed this. Chris, my oldest friend, needed it too, though he wasn't much of a camper. I convinced him to come along, figuring the trip might rekindle our bond. We parked my RV at a quiet trailhead miles from the crowded campgrounds. As I unloaded my gear, Chris sat on a rock, fiddling with a bottle of water. "I still don't know why I agreed to this," he muttered, squinting at the dense forest. "It's like the trees are closing in." I laughed. "That's the point, Chris. We're off the grid. Fresh air, peace, maybe even some wildlife for me to photograph." "Yeah, great. Bears, wolves. That sounds peaceful." I ignored him, shouldering my pack. "Come on, it's a short hike. We'll camp near the river." Chris groaned but followed. The trail was narrow, lined with jagged cliffs and thick underbrush. The gorge lived up to its reputation, stunning, rugged, and untamed. But there was something else too. The air felt heavy. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the humidity. By the time we reached the riverbed, the sun was low on the horizon. I paused, staring. Something was wrong. The river was gone. Where there should have been rushing water, there was only cracked, dry earth. Chris stopped beside me, his expression shifting from annoyance to unease. Evan, are you sure this is the spot?" "Positive," I said, pulling out my map. "The river runs right through here." Chris crouched, touching the dry ground. "Looks like it hasn't been here in years." "That's impossible. It was flowing last week." My voice faltered. It didn't make sense. I felt a flicker of doubt, but quickly buried it. It's probably seasonal, I lied, unwilling to admit how unsettling this was. Let's set up camp. As night fell, the forest came alive, or rather, it didn't. Normally, the woods buzzed with life, insects, frogs, rustling leaves, but here the silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. Chris sat close to the fire, nervously poking at the flames. Does it feel quiet to you? It's remote, I said, fiddling with my camera. Relax, he snorted. Sure, relax while nature murders me. Chris, you're being... I stopped. My camera had just powered down. Frowning, I turned it back on and reviewed the footage from earlier. That's when I saw it. A figure. It was blurry, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably humanoid. It stood at the edge of the frame, hidden among the trees. I blinked, rewound the clip, and zoomed in. The image distorted, the figure disappearing into static. What's wrong? Chris asked, noticing my expression. Nothing, I said quickly, shutting the camera off. Just a glitch. The first night passed without sleep. I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps circling our campsite, stopping just outside the firelight. Every time I shone my flashlight, there was nothing. Nothing. Chris didn't hear it. He was snoring in his tent, blissfully unaware. The next morning, we met Laura. She appeared suddenly, stepping out from the trees as we packed our gear. Her boots were worn, her hair tied back beneath a bandana. She looked like she belonged here, unlike Chris, who flinched at the sight of her. Morning, she said, her tone friendly but guarded. Didn't expect to see anyone this far out. We're camping, I said, forcing a smile, doing some photography. She nodded, her dark eyes scanning the dry riverbed. Strange, isn't it? This river used to run year-round. You've been here before? Chris asked. A few times, she said, but I stay on the main trails now. This area is different. Different how? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She hesitated. You've heard the stories, right? About the Wendigo? Chris groaned. Oh, great, a ghost story. That's what I need. It's not a ghost, Laura said sharply. It's a spirit, a creature. The Wendigo appears when something's wrong, when the land's been disrespected or people have gone too far. It preys on greed and hunger. I laughed, trying to ease the tension. Well, good thing we're not greedy. Laura didn't laugh. She looked at me, then at Chris. Be careful. Things can change quickly out here. Her warning lingered as we hiked deeper into the forest. Chris was unusually quiet, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. I tried to shake off my unease, focusing on setting up new motion sensor cameras. But as I reviewed the footage, the images disturbed me. The cameras had captured blurry shapes, elongated, humanoid figures skirting the edges of the frame. I didn't tell Chris, he was already on edge. That night, the forest came alive with sounds, faint growls, snapping twigs, and something that sounded like breathing. I stayed by the fire, gripping my flashlight while Chris sat rigid beside me. I heard it, he whispered. Tell me you heard it. I heard it, I admitted. Stay close. At some point, Chris stood abruptly. I'm going to the RV. No way, I said. It's too far, but he was already walking into the darkness. I chased after him, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. Chris, stop! He turned, his face pale. Didn't you hear her? Laura's voice. She's calling for help. I stared at him. Chris, Laura's not here. But he wasn't listening. He kept moving faster now until I grabbed his arm and yanked him back. Listen to me, I shouted. You're not thinking clearly. Chris looked at me confused, as if waking from a dream. I thought I heard. The growling returned, closer this time. The foul stench of decay filled the air, making my stomach churn. Something moved in the shadows, too fast to see. Run, I whispered. We sprinted back to camp, but the fire had died. The woods pressed in around us, suffocating and silent. Then came the mimicry. Chris, a voice called identical to mine. He froze, staring into the trees. Evan? What? It's not me, I hissed. Don't listen to it. The voice came again, closer. Chris, help me. Chris grabbed my arm, his face white with fear. What is that? The answer came with the snap of branches. A figure stepped into the clearing. A gaunt, elongated humanoid with glowing eyes and claws that gleamed in the faint moonlight. The smell of rot was overwhelming. It was the Wendigo. I shoved Chris toward the trail. Run! Don't stop! The Wendigo moved with unnatural speed, circling us. Its glowing eyes locked on Chris. It growled, a guttural, bone-chilling sound. Chris tripped, falling hard, and I turned back, swinging my flashlight wildly. The light caught the creature's face, twisted and skeletal, its lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. It flinched, momentarily blinded, and I used the distraction to drag Chris to his feet. We stumbled through the forest, the Wendigo's footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to keep moving. We found Laura at the edge of the forest. She had a torch in one hand and a look of grim determination on her face. "It's here, isn't it?" she said. I nodded, gasping for breath. "What do we do?" "Fire," she said. "It's the only thing that weakens it." Chris was shaking, his face pale. "We're going to die out here." "No, we're not," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We fight." Laura handed me a torch, lighting it with hers. The Wendigo emerged moments later, its movements jerky and unnatural. It circled us, growling, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "Hold your ground," Laura said. "Don't let it separate us." The creature lunged. Faster than I could react, Laura swung her torch. The flames grazed its side and it screeched, recoiling. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard. Chris panicked, dropping his torch and bolting into the woods. "Chris, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. The Wendigo turned, chasing after him. "Stay here," I told Laura, running after my friend. I found Chris slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow. The Wendigo stood over him, its claws poised. I didn't think. I just acted, swinging my torch with all my strength. The flames caught its arm and it howled, retreating into the shadows. Chris looked up at me, his eyes glassy. "Evan," he whispered. "It's inside my head. I can't stop it." "You're fine," I said, pulling him to his feet. "We're getting out of here." We made it back to Laura, but Chris wasn't the same. He muttered incoherently, his eyes darting around like he was seeing things I couldn't. "We have to go," Laura said. "Now." The three of us ran, the Wendigo's growls following us all the way to the RV. When we finally reached it, I shoved Chris inside and slammed the door. Laura and I collapsed, exhausted, but something felt wrong. Chris was silent, sitting in the corner, his head bowed. I approached cautiously. "Chris," I said. He looked up, smiling, a cold, unnatural smile. "You can't escape," he said, his voice distorted. The Wendigo's reflection gleamed in his eyes. We drove away, leaving the gorge behind, but the claw marks on the RV side were a stark reminder of what we'd faced. Chris didn't speak again. His smile was frozen, his eyes distant. As we crossed the state line, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the forest, watching us. We survived, but I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. My name is Amanda Hughes, and I'm 35 years old. This happened last summer during what I thought would be just another adventure to fuel my travel blog. I've spent the better part of my career exploring hidden gems and offbeat places, but nothing, not even the ghost tours in Savannah or the creepy hotels in New Orleans, could have prepared me for Enchanted Rock. I pulled my RV into the campsite just before noon. Enchanted Rock rose in the distance, a massive pink granite dome that glowed faintly under the Texas sun. I'd been here once as a kid, but I couldn't remember much beyond the climb and my mom yelling at me to stay close. This time I was alone, and I planned to capture every bit of its beauty. After parking in a secluded spot, I grabbed my camera and gear, excited to scout the area. The plan was simple: hike to the summit, take some photos, and interview a few locals about the legends. The place had plenty of them, and ancient curses, ghostly sightings, and strange disappearances. Perfect fodder for a post that would rake in clicks. I checked in at the visitor center where I met Maggie, a park ranger who looked to be in her late 50s. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and had a weathered face that reminded me of an old cowboy movie. "First time here?" she asked, her tone friendly but measured. "First time as an adult," I said, smiling. "I'm a travel writer, and I wanted to cover some of the stories about the rock, the spooky stuff." Her expression shifted slightly. "It's a beautiful place, but you need to respect it, especially after dark." "Why? Is it really haunted?" I teased. She hesitated before answering. "There are things here older than you can imagine. The Tonkawa people believe this was a sacred site. They say a warrior cursed it before he died. Instead, I've seen enough strange things to believe there's truth to it." I laughed nervously. "Well, I'm not planning to anger any spirits." Her gaze lingered on me, her eyes serious. "Just don't wander too far off. and if you hear drumming, go the other way. I dismissed her warning as local folklore meant to entertain tourists, but as I hiked up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rock was watching me. The path twisted through clusters of boulders and dry scrub, the air hot and still. Occasionally, I'd hear a bird or the rustle of a lizard darting through the brush, but otherwise, it was unnervingly quiet. About halfway up, I noticed something strange. Symbols etched into the granite. They were rough and jagged, like they'd been scratched in haste, and they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I snapped a few photos, thinking they'd make for a good mystery in my blog. Then, for no reason I could explain, a chill ran down my spine. It was the middle of the day, blazing hot, but the air felt cold and heavy. I brushed it off as nerves and kept climbing. When I reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. The horizon stretched endlessly, the land below dotted with patches of green and the occasional shimmer of water. I set up my tripod and began taking pictures, losing myself in the work. That's when I heard it. A faint drumming sound carried on the wind. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't loud, just a low, steady rhythm, but it seemed to come from all around me. Maggie was just trying to spook you, I muttered, shaking my head. But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, more insistent. I packed up quickly and started back down the trail, my nerves on edge. The shadows seemed darker now, the shapes of the rocks more menacing. I told myself I was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation for the sound. Maybe someone was drumming at the base of the rock. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I stayed in my RV, editing the photos I'd taken. They were stunning, capturing the eerie beauty of the landscape perfectly. But when I scrolled through the shots of the summit, I stopped cold. In one of the pictures taken at the edge of the overlook, there was a figure. It was faint, barely visible, but unmistakably there. A tall, shadowy shape that hadn't been there when I snapped the shot. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Was it a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera? I tried to rationalize it, but the memory of that drumming filled my mind, and suddenly I didn't feel so alone. The first knock came around midnight, soft, tentative, like someone tapping on the side of the RV. My blood turned to ice. I froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. Grabbing a flashlight, I moved to the window and peered outside. The campsite was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the trees. Then I saw it, etched into the side of the RV, that same symbol I'd seen on the rock earlier that day. My hands trembled as I stepped back, my mind racing. Someone was messing with me, they had to be. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a prank. The next morning, I drove to town and asked around about the symbols. Most people didn't recognize them, but an older man at a coffee shop told me they looked like warnings used by the Tonkawa. They marked sacred places, he said, places where the spirits were restless. The word restless stuck with me. On a whim, I stopped by the visitor center and found Maggie. When I told her what had happened, she frowned deeply. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm. "The rock isn't just a place, it's alive, and you've drawn its attention." "Attention?" I repeated, my stomach sinking. "You've disturbed something that doesn't want to be disturbed." I didn't leave. I should have, but my curiosity and my pride kept me there. That night, the drumming returned, louder and closer than before. The air inside the RV felt suffocating, thick with an invisible weight. I tried to sleep, but kept waking to strange noises, footsteps circling the RV, faint whispers just outside the door. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, determined to confront whatever or whoever was tormenting me. The campsite was shrouded in darkness, the trees casting long, jagged shadows as I shone the light around. At the edge of the clearing, I spotted something, an altar of stones arranged in a circle. In the center lay a bundle of feathers and bones, tied with twine. My breath caught. The drumming grew louder, echoing in my ears. And then I saw him, the shadowy figure from my photo. He stood just beyond the altar, his form shifting and flickering like smoke. "You're not real," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." But then he moved, stepping closer. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and the air grew colder with each step. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and the flashlight rolled out of my hand. "Leave," a voice hissed, deep and guttural, reverberating through the clearing. Scrambling to my feet, I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. The drumming stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. At dawn, I packed up and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing on the summit, watching me. I've written about many places since then, but I'll never return to Enchanted Rock. Some things are meant to remain untouched, their stories told in whispers and warnings. And if you ever visit, take Maggie's advice. If you hear drumming, go the other way. My name's Alexander Simmons. It was 2008, and I was on my third night of RV camping just outside the Sierra Nevada mountains, not too far from Mono Lake. Now, I wouldn't call myself an outdoorsman by any stretch of the imagination. Honestly, I was more of a stay inside, sip on something warm kind of guy. But a divorce and a midlife crisis will drive you to some weird places. After a decade of city noise, I figured a solo RV trip into the mountains might clear my head. Turns out, that kind of peace and quiet isn't always as comforting as you'd think. I'd parked my RV at one of those smaller, secluded campsites where you're more likely to find deer than people, which was kind of the point. The first couple of nights were uneventful. Just me, a few beers, and some bad attempts at cooking over a campfire. I'd been telling myself it was the perfect kind of escape, though I'll admit that by night 3, the isolation had started to feel a little less peaceful and more claustrophobic. But what was I going to do? Pack up and head back to the city? Nah, that would have felt like losing. Plus, I was still trying to get used to sleeping in an RV without the constant hum of city life around me. Everything out there was too still. Every tiny crack in the forest made my skin crawl. But hey, what's a little discomfort compared to proving to myself I wasn't totally losing my edge at 41? That night, as I was lying on the RV bed scrolling through some half-downloaded articles on my phone, I noticed the light outside flicker. Not a campfire glow, something sharper, more precise. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, maybe a reflection of something metallic in the distance. But it happened again, this time closer. I sat up, listening. I wasn't one of those paranoid types, but when you're out alone in the mountains, your mind has a way of turning normal things into, well, not so normal things. For a while, nothing happened. The wind rustled the leaves, an owl hooted off in the distance, the kind of noises you should expect in the middle of nowhere. Then, just as I was about to let it go and settle back into my semi-uncomfortable RV bed, there was a sound. Not the wind, not some critter scurrying about. This was the distinct crunch of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the trees just beyond my RV. I slid out of bed and peered out the tiny RV window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the pitch-black woods and the faint silhouette of my truck parked beside the RV. But then there it was, a figure standing still, halfway between the trees and my vehicle. At first, I figured it was just another camper who'd wandered over to the wrong site, but then I realized there wasn't supposed to be anyone else this far out. I hadn't even heard the sound of another RV or car coming in earlier. I squinted, trying to make out more details. The figure stood there frozen, almost like it was waiting for something. They were tall and lanky, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, but something felt off. My gut was telling me this wasn't just some lost hiker, and out here, you don't ignore gut feelings. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitating before I opened the RV door. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't own a gun, never really saw the need in the city, and honestly, I'd thought the RV would provide enough protection from whatever the woods had to offer. You know, deer, maybe a curious bear or something, not a strange man lurking outside. The moment I stepped outside, the figure bolted, fast. I shined my flashlight in the direction they ran, catching a glimpse of a dirty face, long, stringy hair, and something like a wild grin flashing in the dark. But before I could process it, they were gone, disappearing into the thick trees. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that maybe it was just some vagrant who didn't want trouble. But when I got back inside, something had changed. The flashlight beam caught a reflection on the passenger seat of my RV. My heart sank when I saw it. A large hunting knife jammed into the seat. It wasn't mine. Now I know what you're thinking. How could I have missed someone sneaking into my RV? I couldn't tell you. Maybe I had dozed off earlier, or maybe this guy was just good at what he did. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't alone, and whoever this guy was, he had keys. I fumbled for my phone, planning to call the Rangers, but of course, out here, there was no signal. So, like any rational person, I locked every door and window, grabbed the closest thing to a weapon I had, a camping hatchet, and sat in the driver's seat, keeping an eye on the tree line. I wasn't planning on staying the night anymore. At first light, I was getting the hell out of there. But first light didn't come fast enough. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding my adrenaline, because the next thing I knew, it was around 2 a.m., and the entire RV shook. It wasn't a tree falling or some kind of animal bumping into it. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to force their way in. I jumped up, clutching the hatchet, and shouted out, hoping to scare them off, but the pounding didn't stop. When the door finally flew open, it wasn't subtle. The figure from earlier barreled in wildly, grinning and holding a crowbar. There was no conversation, no demands. He lunged at me immediately, swinging the crowbar and catching me off guard. I swung back with the hatchet, but missed. He was faster than I expected. I won't bore you with the gory details, but let's just say it wasn't one of those quick, clean self-defense moments you see in the movies. I got some good hits in, but not before he bashed me pretty good with the crowbar. Blood was everywhere, his, mine. It all blended together in the chaos. At some point, we both fell out of the RV and the fight spilled onto the ground. I don't know how, but I got the upper hand, slamming the hatchet down into his chest. The fight stopped then, just like that. I remember standing over him, gasping for air, not really registering what had happened until I saw the light dimming in his wild eyes. He was gone. I staggered back into the RV, dazed, bloody, and in shock. I locked myself inside, not knowing what else to do. Calling for help wasn't an option out here, so I waited. Just me, the dead guy outside, and the silence of the forest. By the time morning rolled around, I was still wide awake, eyes fixed on the body outside. I don't know why I hadn't moved it. Maybe I just needed the daylight to confirm it wasn't some sick nightmare. Eventually, I stepped out, the crisp mountain air biting at my face. I searched the man's pockets, half expecting to find nothing. But there it was, his wallet. His name was Warren Gibson. He was wanted in 3 states for murder, and here I was, alone with his body, no cell service, and a whole mess of questions I didn't have the answers to. The cops eventually found me that afternoon after a couple of hikers came across my bloodied RV and freaked out. They took one look at me, the body, and started asking the usual questions. I don't even remember half of what I told them, just that it was self-defense, which, to be fair, was the truth. Turns out Warren had been squatting in the mountains for years, preying on isolated campers. They'd been looking for him for a long time. Funny thing is, I'd planned this trip to escape the chaos of the city, to find some peace and quiet. I ended up right in the middle of someone else's nightmare. Still, all things considered, I guess I got off easy.